The photos from that afternoon still exist somewhere. Caps in the air, a rented banner with my brother's name spelled correctly for once, my parents smiling as if the day belonged to them. I stood at the edge of the crowd, hands folded, feeling the familiar ache of being present without being central. It was easier that way. The demand came later when the noise thinned and the hall smelled like warm paper cups and sugar. My brother's voice was steady, practiced. He didn't ask. He declared, "I need $5 million from your trust fund for my startup." He said it the way people say the weather, unchallengeable, already accounted for. My parents didn't look surprised. My mother's hand tightened on her clutch. My father nodded once, as if confirming a thought he'd already finished. "That's your responsibility," my mother said. "Refuse and don't call this family anymore." It was strange how calm I felt. I'd spent years learning the shape of their expectations, the way they leaned on me when something needed fixing and pushed me aside when credit was assigned. The trust fund had been my grandmother's idea, not theirs. She'd insisted on guardrails, on time and purpose. It wasn't a secret. It just hadn't mattered until now. "I can't," I said. Not loudly, not defensively, just accurately. The room seemed to contract. My brother's face hardened into something like embarrassment, wearing anger as a coat. My father's jaw moved, a small mechanical shift that always meant he was done listening. I remember the first shove as confusion, not pain. The second was heavier. After that, memory breaks into pieces, floor against cheek, a sound like furniture moving too fast, my mother's voice saying my name as if she'd misplaced it. Then nothing. When I woke, the ceiling was unfamiliar and the light too white. A nurse asked me questions that felt unrelated to my life. I answered them because that's what you do when someone asks you to prove you're still here. My phone was gone. So was the watch my grandmother had given me on my 21st birthday. The silence around me wasn't empty. It was deliberate. I didn't cry. I waited. Waiting has always been my strength. Not the passive kind, more like knowing that systems, once set in motion, don't need encouragement. A few hours later, a man in a charcoal suit stood at the foot of my bed. He introduced himself with the measured cadence of someone used to rooms like this. He didn't ask what happened. He already knew enough. "I represent your grandmother's estate," he said. "She included an emergency protocol in your trust. Hospital admission due to coercion or injury triggers a review." He placed a folder on the side table. No drama. No sympathy that asked for anything in return. Just paper, weighty with intent. He explained what would happen next. The trust would freeze pending investigation. An independent trustee would step in. Access would be limited to medical and living expenses. Any attempt to pressure or retaliate would be documented and addressed. "Your family will be notified," he added. Formally. I nodded. My throat tightened, not from fear but from recognition. This was my grandmother's voice, translated into policy. She'd always believed love needed structure to survive people like us. The lawyer left. The room settled back into its hum. For the first time since the graduation, I felt safe enough to close my eyes. Messages arrived later, missed calls, then texts that swung between outrage and appeal. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The trust didn't care about tone, only facts. Days passed. I learned the rhythm of healing ice, quiet, short walks down the corridor. The nurse asked if I had family visiting. I said no and meant it without bitterness. When I was discharged, a car was waiting. The driver didn't ask questions. He took me to my apartment, where the door was intact and the air smelled like dust and lemon cleaner. On the counter sat a note from the trustee outlining next steps. Clear. Unemotional. Effective. My brother posted online about resilience and innovation. My parents told friends a version of events that painted them as misunderstood. None of it touched the trust. None of it touched me. Weeks later, I saw my grandmother's handwriting again, in a copy of a letter she'd written years before. Included with the trust documents, it wasn't an apology or a warning. It was practical advice. Boundaries aren't punishments, she'd written. They're instructions for how to keep what matters intact. I thought about calling my parents then. I didn't, not because I was afraid, but because the call would have been a performance, and I was done auditioning. There was no victory dinner. No confrontation scene where truths were hurled like stones. Control didn't swing back with a crash. It settled into place with the quiet click of a lock doing its job. Sometimes I miss the idea of the family we pretended to be. Sometimes I wonder if my brother will ever notice the difference between confidence and entitlement. Those questions don't have answers that change anything. What changed was smaller and more durable. I learned that refusing can be an act of care. That silence can be strategic without being cruel. That survival sometimes looks like letting systems speak for you. And that afternoon, with its banners and applause, finally ended the way it needed to, not with reconciliation but with clarity.